the place where we cut through the noise, unpack complex topics, and really extract the most important insights for you. Today, we're plunging headfirst into a high profile legal case that has, well, it's captured global attention: the criminal trial of Sean Diddy Combs.
Yeah, it really has. And our sources for this deep dive are detailed live updates and recaps from CNN. We're specifically focusing on the prosecution's closing arguments. They just wrapped those up today, June 26th, 2025. It's, their big final push to the jury.
Right. So, our mission here is to really understand the core allegations, grasp the gravity of these legal arguments the prosecution laid out. We want to give you a clear, concise picture of what they claim happened, stripping away the sensationalism to get to the legal heart of it.
Absolutely. And we're talking about some incredibly serious federal charges here: racketeering, conspiracy, sex trafficking, transportation for prostitution, serious stuff. The prosecution's challenge, and what we'll explore, is how they tried to connect all these different alleged actions into one sort of cohesive narrative.
That's a huge task. Okay, let's unpack this then. The prosecution's closing, it painted a stark and frankly pretty damning picture. They directly urged the jury, basically said it's time to hold Sean Diddy Combs accountable. It's not just about individual incidents for them, is it?
No, absolutely not. Prosecutor Christy Slavic, she opened by calling Combs the leader of a criminal enterprise. That's like the foundation right there. They're trying to frame every single alleged act as part of a bigger systematic pattern.
And her core point was that up until now, Combs had allegedly gotten away with these things.
Yeah.
Because of his money, his power, his influence. That's what she said. It feels like they're tackling that public perception head on, the idea that he's been untouchable.
Precisely. Yeah. This big accusation sets the stage, gives context for every charge, every piece of evidence. They need the jury to see a pattern, not just, separate events.
Okay, so speaking of charges, Combs pleaded not guilty. Racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking, potentially life in prison if he's convicted on everything. What are the specific counts they outlined? And how do they tie back to this criminal enterprise idea?
Right. So they laid out 5 specific counts. And what's really crucial here is understanding how things like transportation for prostitution or forced labor, they're considered predicate acts. These predicate acts fall under the big umbrella of the racketeering conspiracy charge.
Predicate acts like the building block.
Exactly. Think of it like building a wall. Each brick is a predicate act, one of the underlying crimes, and they all build up the whole structure, which is the racketeering charge.
Okay, that's a really helpful way to think about it. So with that framework, how did the prosecution actually try to prove these things to the jury? Let's dive into the specifics, maybe start with those really disturbing allegations about forced labor.
Yeah, that was a significant and pretty harrowing part of their case, focused on forced labor. They claimed several witnesses were victims. You had Cassie Ventura, Jane, that's the pseudonym for a former girlfriend, Mia, who was Combs' assistant, and Capricorn Clark, another former employee.
The testimony from Ventura and Jane, it sounded incredibly disturbing. The prosecution said Combs forced them into, grueling, days-long sexual encounters without sleep. How do they argue that wasn't consensual, but actual forced labor?
Well, Slavic claimed these acts alleged sex with multiple men, multiple times over days, wasn't for their pleasure. She flat out called it work. And she detailed the physical toll source, sickness, persistent UTIs allegedly resulting from these activities.
Wow. And they said the women had to keep going, even when sick. Told to keep going, finish strong. That paints a picture of just extreme coercion.
It really does. And then there was Mia, Combs' former assistant. She also testified she was required to provide sexual services. She alleged sexual assaults by Combs himself when his girlfriends weren't available, including one instance of forced oral sex.
And Mia felt she had no choice because of his power and control as her boss. She also talked about violence against her, objects thrown, her arms slammed in a door, and seeing violence towards Cassie Ventura, too.
Right. The prosecution really highlighted this idea that Mia endured a cycle of abuse, something that created a trauma bond. That bond, they argued, made it hard for her to even fully grasp what was happening to her at the time.
A trauma bond. That's that psychological thing where the victim gets attached to the abuser, right?
Yeah.
Makes it hard to leave.
Exactly. It's complex, involves cycles of abuse, and then maybe positive reinforcement. Crucial for the jury to understand why someone might stay in that situation.
And it wasn't just sexual acts. Capricorn Clark, the other former employee, she alleged forced labor too, right? Something about overtime pay.
Yeah, she claimed Combs ripped up an $80,000 overtime tally she had kept. And she described the HR department at his company as basically a puppet, not advocating for employees at all.
So even if she came back for other jobs later, the prosecution argued that two didn't cancel out the earlier forced labor.
Correct. Slavic argued that Combs basically made sure she couldn't easily work elsewhere in the industry, allegedly telling her she'd never work again. That's powerful control.
Okay, so given all these allegations of forced labor, this control, how did the prosecution then connect that to the specific charge of sex trafficking? What's the extra step there?
Right. That's where the freak offs and the hotel nights involving Cassie, Ventura, and Jane become central. For the sex trafficking counts, the key element is transportation. The jury has to find he knowingly transported people across state lines or even internationally, specifically for prostitution. It's about moving people for that purpose.
So it's the movement across borders combined with the alleged purpose. Did they give specific examples of this?
Oh, yeah, numerous examples. Slavic detailed Combs allegedly paying for male escorts to travel for these encounters with Ventura and Jane. She mentioned him personally organizing logistics with guys like Jules, supposedly flown to New York in '09 for a freak off with Ventura. And Sly, an entertainer from Atlanta who allegedly took part in hotel nights in LA, Miami, New York. Also, Paul, who allegedly went to Turks and Caicos for a hotel night just last year, March 2023. They even showed texts about payment arrangements between Combs and Paul.
Wow. And it wasn't just witness testimony supporting this, they had other records.
They did. They showed hotel records from one alleged event. There was like a $4,000 charge for damaged furniture, and testimony that cleaning staff found bodily fluid stains on the floor, trying to make it very concrete for the jury.
Okay. And the prosecution also kept emphasizing the control Combs allegedly had over Ventura throughout their relationship, right? Not just financially.
Exactly. Spanning her whole life, basically. Her career, how she looked, how she spent her time. They argued he deliberately fostered financial dependency, paying for her car, her phone, her apartment, making it harder for her to leave or say no.
So when she tried to end it in 2018, the prosecutor alleged Combs demanded control until the very end, and that's when the alleged rape occurred.
That's what Slavic alleged, yes. And they argued these freak-offs, they happened within this context of ongoing alleged violence. And crucially, they claimed Combs used recordings of these events as collateral, like blackmail, basically, to coerce Ventura into continuing.
So even if she said no, like they mentioned happened on her 29th birthday, the freak-offs allegedly happened anyway, because he didn't take no for an answer.
That was the prosecution's assertion. And they also brought up drugs. Ventura described them as dissociative and numbing. Then lay. The prosecution argued drugs were a key part of the coercive scheme. Ventura apparently testified she couldn't imagine having a freak-off without them, suggests impaired consent.
Okay, but what about messages? The defense might point to explicit messages from Ventura suggesting she consented. That seems like a hurdle. How did the prosecution deal with that?
Yeah, that's a really important question. Slavic tackled it directly. She argued that, yes, those messages exist, but they were essentially a survival tactic, a way for Ventura to keep Combs happy, to try and feel safe in a situation where she felt she had no real choice. Consent under duress isn't real consent, is their argument.
Right, context matters. They also shared that really chilling story about the Cannes Film Festival incident.
Allegedly kicked her off a boat in France, no passport, no belongings. Then on the flight back to New York, allegedly held her captive, forced her to watch videos he'd recorded of the freak-offs, threatened to release them.
That's coercion through reputational harm, basically. Holding those videos over her head.
Exactly. That's what the prosecution argued. A powerful tool of control. Slavic wrapped that up by saying Ventura didn't really know what no would be or what no would turn into, portraying her as living in a climate of fear where she just couldn't make voluntary adult choices. That's the core of the forced element.
It sounds like a huge operation, according to the prosecution.
Yeah.
They argued Combs didn't do this alone, right? What about his inner circle?
Yeah, a key part of their argument was he did not do it alone. He relied on loyal lieutenants, as they put it. They specifically named Christina Coram, his former chief of staff, and D-Rock, the security guard.
Coram. She allegedly helped set up the hotel rooms, planned these Wild King nights, that was her term, and facilitated travel for escorts, got cash for Combs. Sounds like she was deeply involved, if the allegations are true.
That's what the prosecution claimed. Slavic argued that even if Coram seemed disapproving sometimes, she knew exactly what was happening and made sure Combs had everything he needed. They played an audio message from Combs asking for the sexiest, most unapologetic Wild King sex room in Vegas, sent to her.
Wow. And D-Rock, the security guard, what was his alleged role?
They alleged he did things like take Ventura's belongings away, physically brought her back to Combs when she tried to run away, even tended to her injuries sometimes. Slavic argued that showed he knew what Cassie and the defendant were doing for days at a time. Suggests complicity beyond just security duties.
Okay, so enabling the alleged acts, but then the prosecution also brought up witness tampering after the civil suit.
Yes, absolutely. Slavic alleged that after Cassie Ventura filed her civil lawsuit back in November 2023, Combs started trying to obstruct justice, trying to neutralize potential witnesses who could hurt him in a criminal investigation, which he likely knew was coming.
And this ties back into the racketeering charge too, right? Showing an ongoing pattern.
Exactly. It's not just about past acts, it's about alleged ongoing criminal activity to cover things up. They claimed he used his inner circle again, like D-Rock, to pressure Mia and Jane.
How specifically did they say this tampering happened?
Well, D-Rock allegedly contacted Mia after 2 years of silence, suggested a false story about what happened, later allegedly offered her money, and apparently kept Combs updated. Combs himself allegedly called Mia 5 times straight at 6 a.m. one morning, texted her asking her to jog his memory. Sounds like fresher.
And they had recordings related to Jane too, from Courtroom's phone.
Yeah, this is pretty specific. Recordings allegedly caught Combs trying to feed Jane the false narrative about past events, and apparently you could hear a Sharpie writing on paper in the background, suggesting Courtroom was right there taking notes during these calls.
Quite a detail. And did they allege Combs offered incentives too?
Slavic claimed he dangled a carrot, told Jane she wouldn't have to worry about anything if she was on his side. And then, just 2 days later, allegedly told Courtroom to make sure Jane's rent was still being paid, connects the alleged tampering directly to money.
And the prosecution reminded the jury he was denied bail 3 times because of ongoing obstruction concerns.
They reiterated that point, arguing it showed he posed a continuing risk in their view.
So, after laying all of that out for over 4 hours, how did they conclude?
They basically summarized all this evidence, connected the dots back to the racketeering and other charges, and repeated their call for accountability. A final, forceful plea to the jury.
And what happens now? What's the next step in the trial?
Tomorrow morning, Friday, 9 a.m. Eastern, the defense gets their turn. Mark Agnifilo leads Combs' team. They'll present their closing arguments. Then the government gets a shorter rebuttal. And finally, the judge gives the jury instructions before they start deliberations.
So that's the final stage before the jury decides. A real battle of narratives about to unfold.
Absolutely. It's all down to how the jury weighs these competing stories and the evidence presented.
Okay, so what does all this mean for you listening? This deep dive into just the prosecution's closing. It gives you a really powerful, sometimes unsettling look at the allegations. It shows how they're trying to build this case of a complex criminal enterprise. It's not just a list of bad acts, it's a legal strategy.
Yeah, it really illuminates how they build a racketeering case, connecting alleged sex trafficking, forced labor, witness tampering, weaving it all together, showing how these distinct things, they argue, are part of a larger systemic pattern of alleged control and abuse. Understanding that structure is key.
And it's also, a pretty sobering look at how things like money, power, influence, even recordings, how those can allegedly be used as tools in coercive schemes.
Yeah.
It shifts the focus from just incidents to this alleged pattern of manipulation.
Right. And if you connect this to the bigger picture, just understanding the details of these arguments, whatever the verdict ends up being, it gives you real insight into the dynamics of alleged abuse, the challenges of holding powerful people accountable. It forces you to think about those hidden mechanisms of control.
Definitely. And maybe a final provocative thought for you to consider as we wait for the defense. How might the defense team take these exact same events, the same evidence we just discussed, and frame it completely differently for the jury? What could that reveal about the huge differences in perspective and interpretation when the stakes are this high in court?